Hi, everyone. This is Rafi. I'm here with Herman Pontzer, an associate professor at Duke University. So thanks for making the time, Herman.
Yeah, man, happy to join you.
Thanks. So we were talking about a lot of anthropology over Twitter and aspects of metabolism and different things. So we have a lot of subjects that we have in common. So I would just like you to say, introduce yourself, tell us who you are, how come you're interested in these aspects of metabolism and anthropology, and how you got to become an associate professor who's now published a book called Burn, right, on metabolism and I guess
That's
evolution
right.
to some extent.
That's right. The book is called Burn.
Yeah.
Everybody should check it out. I'm interested in human evolution. I'm trained as an anthropologist, as a evolutionary anthropologist. And I've always been interested in energy expenditure because, that's kind of where the rubber hits the road in biology. It's how, life is a game of turning energy into offspring. And so, if you understand how a species spends its energy, you understand a lot about how it evolved and how it lives its life. And I wanted to understand that for humans. And so I've been studying, I started off studying energy expenditure during locomotion. So the energy costs to walk and run and how that's related to postcranial anatomy, leg length, muscle length, that kind of thing. And I did a lot of biomechanics and also experimental work, measuring calories on treadmills with humans and dogs, and we've done chimpanzees and everything else. And then I got interested in thinking about, okay, here's the energy expenditure for movement, for ranging, for moving around your landscape. Let's understand that in the larger context of energy expenditure for everything, the whole energy budget. And that got me interested in measuring energy expenditures, total daily energy expenditures, all the calories spent all day with humans, because nobody had ever done it with hunter-gatherers before. And also with other ape species, because nobody had done it with any ape species before. And so, if you want to understand humans, you need to understand hunter-gatherers, because that's where we're all from. And if you want to understand our lineages, our evolution, you have to understand it in context of the other apes, right? You have to have the comparison, and the other apes are the comparison. And so I've been doing that work for about 12 years now. We set up a laboratory to do doubly-labelled water, which is this isotope tracking method, to do total energy expenditures with anything and anybody. So we have a paper in review right now on dolphins, and we've done dogs, and we've done humans, of course, and all the apes, and we do anything we can get our hands on because it's fun. But so, and this book kind of came out of that work because we discovered a lot of really sort of surprising things and interesting things when we looked at metabolism that way with humans and other apes and that kind of thing. So we can talk about, I don't know which aspects of that we want to talk about first, but that was the genesis of the book, was that metabolism work.
Right. That's super interesting. So you're taking a really wide sort of breadth of really big perspective on this. So that's really interesting. And so you talked about this technique, doubly-labelled water. So maybe you want to explain what that is, briefly, and then we can talk about how, because you can use it in so many species in their free living situation, which is kind of amazing, really, how advanced the physics is and how sort of accurate it is. So yeah, please tell us about that.
Yeah, it's this technique that got the chemistry behind it was developed in the 50s, but we've only been able to use it in humans since about the 80s, because the isotope technology and the mass spectrometry technology only got good enough then. But basically, you drink water. So water is H's and O's, right? Hydrogen and oxygen. Mm-hmm. Some of the water you drink is deuterium. So some of the hydrogens are a different isotope of hydrogen. Some of the oxygens are oxygen 18, so they're a different isotope of oxygen. And so you drink water that has higher levels of those isotopes. They're stable and safe. You don't have to worry about radiation or anything like that. You drink that water, and then the enrichment of those isotopes goes up. It goes into equilibrium in your body. So now your levels are higher, and we could measure that. If we got a urine sample or a saliva sample or a blood sample, we'd see your body water is higher in those isotopes, right? And then over time, over about a week, or you can go 10 days or even 2 weeks if you do it right, you can watch those isotopes get flushed out of the body and replaced with normal water, right? Mm-hmm. Now here's the trick. The hydrogens, so the deuterium isotope, it's getting lost as water that you lose. So when you breathe water vapor out, or you sweat out, or you urinate, or any way you lose water, you lose the hydrogen. So we can track the loss of hydrogen over time. The oxygen isotope you also lose as water, but you also lose it as CO2 that you exhale. So when you exhale CO2s, as carbon dioxide, half of those O's in the CO2 is from your body water, actually. That's the biochemistry of that. It works out that some of that, half of those O's that you breathe out in CO2 are from your body water. And so you're losing the O's as water, but also as CO2. And so if we look at your O depletion, and we subtract out the hydrogen depletion, so we subtract out the water signal, all we have left is the CO2 signal. And so it's this really precise measurement for CO2 per day. And if we know how much CO2 you're producing per day, we can figure out how many calories you're burning per day.
Yeah, and this can be used in a lab setting or in a free living setting.
Yeah,
so it's really
all
good
you
to
need is a
compare.
urine sample every couple of days. Even you can even just do a urine sample at the beginning and at the end. When we go to the field, you know, you worry about samples getting ruined or problems, and so we always get more than just beginning and end. We get all the way through, so we know we have a good measurement. But yeah, every couple of days you get a urine sample. Otherwise, people are living their normal life, or the chimps or the gorillas are living their normal life. You can't do it in the wild with apes because you couldn't get them to drink the water. That's the trick.
Right.
But in a zoo, you can get them to drink the water very easily, and then the urine sample collection is pretty simple.
Yeah, you know, it's a great technique. I loved learning about that one.
Yeah.
And so that can tell you a lot about how much energy we expend, basically.
Yeah.
Right. Is the point, is that it can really give us a good idea of that. So why is that important? Because some people will say, well, it's only half of the equation, right? And that's true, but it's still really important. So you can tell us why.
Well, that's right. I mean, it is important for different reasons. If you're a physiologist like me, an evolutionary biologist like me, that energy expenditure number tells you all of the activities of the body all day, how busy they are. And it tells you something about the investment, right, of that species in these different tasks, you know, whether it's movement or immune function or reproduction, right? That's the total budget. And so in evolutionary biology, we're kind of doing this forensic accounting. We want to follow the calories because that helps us understand what that species has evolved to do. From a public health point of view, and actually, I didn't start off doing any kind of public health stuff. That wasn't the idea, but I've gotten into obesity work now because of the relevance for this stuff. But, you know, like you said, it's half of the equation. So your energy balance, energy in the food that you eat, energy out in the energy that you burn off, you know, when those are in balance, you stay the same weight. When they're out of balance, you either lose weight or gain weight, right? And so things like obesity, or, you know, on the other side of that, malnutrition, but that's less of a public health crisis in places like the US, but it's still an important thing to think about. Those imbalances become important to understand. And so, and one of the things we've discovered with the Hadza, so the human measurements I've been doing, we started off doing this with the first big human study I did was with the Hadza hunter-gatherer community in northern Tanzania. Because like I say, you know, humans are hunter-gatherers. That's what we want to know about. There hadn't been any measurements of total energy expenditure in hunter-gatherers before. And of course, they're really, really physically active, right? So the Hadza in northern Tanzania, if you don't know, they live in grass houses in the middle of the savannah. Men get like 19,000 steps a day. Women get 13,000 steps a day, plus other work that they're doing. They don't have any machines, no guns, no electricity, no plumbing. I mean, it's all wild food. It takes a lot of work to get it. So they get more activity in a day than most people in Europe or the US get in a week. And so because they have these high levels of activity, we thought, oh, they'll burn more calories every day. And in fact, we didn't see that at all. The big surprise was, even if you're really super active, right? If you have enough time to adjust, your body will adjust, it seems. And they have the same energy expenditures, the same total energy expenditure every day as me, who, you know, I try to exercise a little bit, but I'm not as active as a Hadza.
Yeah, I learned about that a few years ago and found that fascinating as well, because how different it is, how the perceived effort and how many calories you expend, those things are quite decoupled actually in reality. And it's sort of, that's why it feels so unrewarding sometimes, because you're like, man, I've have been sweating like a pig here for
Yeah.
actually, if I could accurately measure how many calories I expended, I'd probably be pretty disappointed when I could see it represented as, a pat of butter or a bite of a sandwich or something. You'd be like, oh man, I've got so much more work to do.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Well, yeah. So I mean, that's another reason. So one of the reasons I wrote the book was to kind of help people understand what metabolism really is, right? Because you spend most of if you read the health literature or the magazines or online, exercise, energy expenditure is all about exercise, right? That's all people talk about. But actually, even if you're a pretty active person, most of your energy every day is spent on everything else, right? Immune function and just keeping yourself alive. Do you hear this banging in my house? I'm sorry if you do.
Yeah, a little, but you're coming through nice and clear, so it's fine.
All right, sorry. Yeah, of course, this is the day that we get renovations done. But
right.
Anyway, so yeah, even if you're an active person, 60% of your calories are actually burnt on things that you never even know about, right? Your brain burns 300 calories a day. That's like running a 5K, right? Every day, and it doesn't take any days off. And so it's a big to understand how the body balances these different costs. So the Hods are the really active, and the reason they have these energy expenditures that are the same as you and me. Two things. One is, you're right, activity isn't as expensive as we think it is. But the other thing is, the body can adjust, it appears, and spend less on things that you don't really notice, and more on activity if you change your lifestyle. And so you can actually juggle the way that the calories are being spent. And that's an active area of research that we're really excited about right now, is trying to understand how that gets changed.
Have you ever thought about or seen some literature maybe on something called the desaturase index, and how you have these different ratio fatty acids and how they can affect metabolism, whether they can induce more of a torpor state or more of a I don't know if that's the correct term, hypermetabolic state where you're more active. Has that come across your research? And if so, what do you think of it?
Yeah, so you and I had a back and forth on this before too, about high fat diets and low fat diets, about the effect on expenditure. There is, as far as I understand the literature, and I'm not a biochemist, so maybe I am missing important papers. As far as I understand literature, the amount of energy needed to, for example, to process fatty acids, there are more steps in that digestion, in that metabolism, than there are in metabolizing glucose, for example. And there are potentially metabolic signals that would affect the hypothalamus, for example, and could affect energy expenditure that way. And so there's reason to think that changing dietary macronutrients would have a big effect on total daily energy expenditure, or even on basal metabolic rate. I'm not convinced that we actually see that. So Kevin Hall and I don't know what Guo's first name is, did a meta-analysis of this and found no evidence of a keto diet on expenditure. David Ludwig, wrote a follow-up to said, no, it's there if you look. I think it was 17 days. Was it 17 days was the key thing,
like
right?
That, yeah.
So he did he said it takes 2 weeks to adjust. Right. And so you have to look past to that. Now, the problem with that paper, and we kind of got into this on Twitter, which was fun. And so if you look at the papers that he cites as showing big effects on expenditure after post 2 weeks, there are only a handful of studies out there. There are very few. And so, okay, that means that we need more data. The points that he picked out there, some of them you could argue are he picked points that help his hypothesis and might not be the best point. So, for example, there's an Ebling study where they get people to lose weight, and by the way, they get them to lose weight on just a regular calorie restriction diet. They don't give them a ketosis. So they lose weight, and then you can assign them either a low carb diet or a regular low calorie diet for maintenance. And they say, look, on a low carb diet, people had higher expenditures by like 200 calories a day or something like this, compared to the other, the low fat diet.
Mhm.
That's true if you compare. So when somebody's expenditures are here normally, you put them on a diet, they go down, and then after maintenance, they come back up again a little bit. That happened in both the diets, actually. They went down really far and they both came up a little bit.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at somebody's, the question is, where do you compare to? So at baseline before the diet and the maintenance phase after the diet, there actually was no difference in the diets. There's actually no difference in the high fat or low fat diet there. Right. But you do see an effect if you compare the lowest part before the bounce and back up. And there was a much bigger depression. As it happened, the people who ended up getting assigned to the ketosis diet, maintenance diet, happened to have substantially lower dip than the other ones did, but they actually came back to the same place. And so the question is, well, did you just catch people? I mean, if you compare to baseline, which would be, some might argue, the better comparison, because you're comparing baseline state to weight maintenance state, you don't see an effect. And can you justify the dip? And then why did they dip more?
Yeah.
He also uses a Kevin Hall study that shows an effect of weight. There was a weight loss study. And he decides to go with the doubly-labelled water measurements versus the calorimetry chamber measurements. Now, I like doubly-labelled water a lot,
right?
But what it does do is it includes all the other things that might be happening in your life, like differences in activity level or something like that. Whereas that doesn't happen as much in the calorimetry chamber. And if the calorimetry chamber don't show the data, don't show the effect that Ludwig is arguing for. There's a nice recent study where, and you probably know this one, where they had a low fat diet against a low carb ketotic diet, and then also a low carb ketogenic diet with ketone salts added. And it was a 6-week study, so that's a pretty good long study. And they show, and all three diets, ketogenic with, ketogenic without ketone salts, and the low fat diet, they're isocaloric, so they're eating the same calories per day. Everybody lost the same amount of weight. So if there was an energy expenditure difference there, what should have happened is the ketogenic diet should have lost more, right? Because the energy in was clamped, it was stuck the same, and we should have seen more weight loss there. So I'm not, there might be an effect there that's not, maybe there is, and we haven't looked at the right way, and maybe David Ludwig's right, and maybe I'm being too strict. I'm not convinced yet that there's a measurable or clinically important effect of macronutrient intake on energy expenditure side, because that's not the data I'm seeing, but I'm happy to have my mind changed by data.
And you think that if you were to see a difference in energy expenditure based on maybe not a particular macronutrient, but say the difference between two kinds of fats, for example, if they could, would you think that's plausible, or do you think that could function sort of like how we think of fructose for fat storage? Like, is there an analogy there for you in your mind, or are you not so much convinced by that either?
It could be. What I think is, I think that the body seems to me, what I've learned, and completely unexpected because I didn't think that I would see this. I've learned that the body is incredibly good at homeostasis. I mean, we all knew this, right? But I think that part of the homeostasis environment that your body is trying to maintain seems to be, it wants to keep energy expenditure, energy throughput pretty similar no matter what you do. And so, it might be that there is a change in the energy cost of metabolism. By metabolism, I mean specifically of taking those fatty acids, and because depending on which kind of fatty acids you have, changing them into ATP, right, in the cell. It's not clear to me that would end up showing up on the global measures of energy expenditure that we see, because the body can do so many things to adjust and keep it kind of the same. So I don't know. I think the jury is out. It would be neat to see. That would be really cool to see. And I look forward to those data. I know it's possible. I guess, in principle. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation that's going on that I think well, one reason it's interesting, it's because I think it can be this sort of explanation that goes beyond the carb to fat sort of framing. I think that it can actually, it's kind of interesting because it goes back to how strongly you believe that insulin signaling is at the root of fat gain. If you have the perspective that the fat cell is what you want to understand as the unit of disease, in a sense, when it's getting too fat or hyperplastic or hypertrophic, then you can start looking at fats and how they tell the adipocyte to store energy and how much they tell it to resist insulin. And it's interesting because there's a way where you could accommodate a lower fat paradigm and a higher fat paradigm, both as being slimming, for the same reason, having to do with adipocyte insulin sensitivity. And to do that, you would have to have a particular differences in how fats are handled. And the idea here is that linoleic acid would be the insulin sensitizing fat at the level of fat cells, and that this would be a condition where for a given level of insulin, you're just going to fatten more easily, everything else being equal, independently of how your intake or expenditure changes. So that to me is interesting because in my mind, if I'm trying to simplify it, I'm sort of always thinking, okay, how can I explain the Inuit and how can I explain the Catawbans? That's sort of how, I try to set it up in my mind, because those are as divergent of an observation as you can have. And I think that the kind of fatty acid, the total amount of carbohydrate, the quality of the carbohydrate are all factors that can affect insulin signaling for very different reasons. So to my mind, that's sort of an attempt at a unifying mechanism. And that's why I'm so interested in what changes energy expenditure and trying to understand your perspective in burn, because I'm curious about the effects we see in the Kevin Hall studies, which are like super interesting. There's so much data to dig into there. And you're trying to understand how the low-fat diet can do what it does, because it's very impressive at first to have this spontaneous reduction in intake. And you just have to wonder what's happening at the adipocytes. At least that's where my mind goes. Like, where are those calories going, and is that changing our behavior? Our food-seeking behavior, for instance.
Yeah. It's an interesting perspective. I have to say, after we published the first Hadza paper, 2012. We got the data 2010, published the first Hadza paper 2012. Gary Taubes actually reached out to us, to me, and said, hey, this is interesting stuff, but this focus on calories is kind of misplaced, and really what you should be focusing on is at the time it wasn't which kind of fatty acid, it was just on macronutrients at the time. And he laid out the carbohydrate insulin model for me, and he was really nice and he, really generous with his time. And so I really looked into it, and I read up on the model, and and I've been following the work since. I'm not persuaded, I have to say. And again, data will tell us who's right in the end, but a few things to think about here, from my perspective anyway. You have a number of, so if carbohydrate in the diet is really what makes you fat, then we have some really strange observations then. For example, the Hadza, right? They get a lot of carbohydrate. In fact, they get more carbohydrate than the standard American diet. And they get a lot of it from honey all year round. Now, we can argue if they're a great model for the past. No population anywhere is the perfect model for all humans. I mean, of course not. So, but what they are is they're a good model for themselves. And what they show you is that you can eat a very high carbohydrate diet and be completely slim. They don't have any obesity issues. Same for other subsistence groups alive today, the Chimani, the Shuar. Whether or not we can we can talk about what happened in the past, and that's another conversation we should have.
Right.
Whether or not you can say those are good models for the past, they're good models for themselves. And they're eating really high carbohydrate diets, and they have no obesity, no diabetes, no insulin resistance, right? I mean, they do fine. And so that's interesting to me. And then the other thing is that if you look at the genetics of obesity, what genetic variants seem to predict your likelihood of obesity? There's like 900 variants, 900 genes whose variants are known. They aren't active in the adipocytes, right? They're active in the brain. And that suggests to me an energy regulation thing. How much, your brain is sensing how many calories you're eating, and it's, the hunger and satiety thing. And then you have Kevin Hall's and other people's kind of controlled diet studies that don't, as far as I read it, if they don't show the carbohydrate insulin model results that we would have expected. And so, we can disagree on the interpretations of the data for sure. But, I think me and other folks who take my perspective, I think just it would have been great. It would be awesome if that was the model. It's such a cool model. It doesn't seem to fit what I see.
So here we've been talking about it so we've been talking about the cause of obesity, right? Explicitly, what do people have in their diets, and does that make sense as a cause of obesity? Then there's the question of how do you lose fat, or how do you reverse obesity, which aren't exactly the same thing. They're of course potentially very much related. They're not necessarily the same. And in that case, do you think there's more to the adipocyte view of obesity? Do you think, okay, at this point we do have stuff that's going wrong, and it's more or less reasonable to expect different sensitivity to insulinogenic foods, for instance, or something of that matter? Do you think it makes more sense, or it's just there's still nothing there to really change?
I still think it comes down to just calories. And here's the thing. I think that low carb diets, ketogenic diets, they work amazingly well. And they work really well, I think, because you feel full on fewer calories, right? You can only eat so much of the, if your brain is getting a high fat, high protein signal, then it's sensory specific satiety, right? You get full on that. And you've told yourself, I'm not going to eat any carbs. And so you feel full, you're full, you eat less, right? And of course, you get really great results early on as you deplete your glycogen stores. And I mean, of course, so that it's even a faster result. So that's encouraging. It makes you maybe feel like this is really working. But, there have been studies done assigning people to different diets randomly. You get a high carb diet, you get a low carb diet, right? But everybody is supposed to be cutting calories, and they all work the same. In terms of, adherence is basically the same. The benefit of, the weight loss for different levels of adherence is basically the same. The benefits you get in terms of insulin resistance, CRP levels, that kind of thing, is the same with weight loss. And so, again, I think it's not. It could have worked out differently, right? There's a clear prediction that says, a low carb diet will be superior to these other diets. And when I look at the data, I don't see that. But more data is always good.
Yeah. And have you tried one yourself? Or have you ever had to
no, I'm one of these annoying people. I feel really lucky. I'm the same weight as I was in college.
Right.
So I've never, and so maybe it would be different for me if I had to personally work with it too. I know. And the thing is, I feel like we get painted, as these sort of tribal people that, oh, you're low carb, oh, you're low fat. I don't think it has to be like that. I think everybody, I think, acknowledges or should that low carb diets work great for a lot of people, and they seem to work, without the hunger feelings and all that stuff. I just have a different view of why, what the mechanism is underneath the hood.
Yeah.
But no, I'm not surprised that some people have a lot of success with them, and it's great to see. I think it should be an option out there for people for sure.
Yeah, and do you think that, so when it comes to, because of course how we diagnose a problem is going to affect with the sort of advice that we're going to give people.
Yeah.
So So how do you expect the advice to be different from someone who carries more of your perspective? How does the advice change from someone who has, it doesn't even have to be low carb, it could be some other diet theory with some other proposed
Yeah.
mechanism. How does that change? Because I guess, should the advice change very much, or?
Well, so I don't know, but here's what I think. If I have a perspective that says there's this one mechanism that makes people fat, or this one mechanism that will help them lose weight, and they try that mechanism and it doesn't work, then you have nowhere to go, right? Either you're not doing it right, so it's your personal, you failed, okay, that's not good. Or, wow, this thing that I really was sure was totally right, this my worldview is wrong, and this is really uncomfortable for people. They don't like that, right? And so that challenges your sort of understanding of how the world works. It seems scary. And if you do lose that, then where do you go next? How do you believe anybody if you can't believe that? So that worries me a little bit, that we have these really narrow prescriptions for narrow explanations for why different diets work. If instead my perspective would be, you want to find a diet that, with the way that your brain is wired, based on your genetics and your personal experience and how you relate with food, if you can find a diet that you feel full on fewer calories, you will lose weight. And that might be a ketogenic diet, and that might be a low fat diet, and that might be a Mediterranean diet. And so I would say that my perspective is there's a lot of possibilities. And so you can shop around to find the one that works for you better. So, I mean, I'm not an MD, I'm not a dietitian, but if I was going to be counseling somebody on weight loss, that's what I would say. Like, yeah, ketogenic diet's great, give it a try. But if you hate it, you have options. There are other things to try.
Gotcha. And do you have a preference, or maybe do you have a template in your mind to what the general human diet looks like? Something that's common to pretty much everyone, at least as a starting point to construct a diet, like some principles?
Yeah. So I think the principles would be, stay away from the ultra processed foods, right? It's the Michael Pollan advice, right? Eat food that your grandparents would recognize. Fruits and vegetables and meats, and simple, not overly processed things. I don't think there's anything wrong with pasta or bread personally. Whole grain, of course, is better. And if it says added sugars or added fats, then stay away. That's my principles. Susan Holt did some really great work, and I haven't seen it followed up much. But Susan Holt did some nice work in the 90s. People would eat different foods, and then the same number of calories of the different foods. And then an hour later and 2 hours later, she would ask, how hungry do you feel? Very simple study. I love this study. And you could actually rate which foods make you feel full for longer. And no surprise, protein helps you feel full for longer. Fiber helps you feel full for longer. Fat maybe does. That data from that paper I'm thinking of was a little less obvious, but I could imagine fat might be very satiating for a long time. But fiber and protein for sure, right? And so if your goal is to eat more protein and more fiber, well, there's a lot of ways to get there, right? You could have spinach and steak and be low carb. You could be beans and lentils and whole grain rice and be totally vegetarian. Anyway, I mean, that's again, I'm not a dietitian, but that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah. So do you think it's more we're left with an informational problem? Is that why people are still getting fatter, and they just don't know, or they don't have access, or what?
Well, it's multi-causal, right? But I'm curious to hear what you think. But my personal perspective is we have changed the way that we get our food, and we have outsourced food production. We don't get our own food anymore. Instead, companies make our food for us, and they make money by selling us more food, and they make money by selling us food that can sit on a shelf and is, and so what do? They're not trying to make anybody obese, but they want you to buy more. And so, and they want it to be stuff that's easy to produce and easy to sit on a supermarket shelf. And so they make these ultra processed foods that, last forever in a package on a shelf in a supermarket. They are delicious, right? I mean, who doesn't love like a bag of crisps or whatever it is? Or, I mean, you can't stay away, man. And it's real, it's addictive in a way. And that is if you look at a supermarket footprint, that's 80% of the store, right? And it's easy, it wins on every level. It's tastier, it's interesting, it is easy, it's cheap, right? And so, okay, if you're you or you're me and you think about these things a lot because this is your career, then you go into the supermarket and you're making very particular choices about the food you eat. If you have kids at home and money's tight and time is tight, and and you don't think about these things overly, it's not your career, you go in and you buy what tastes good and what's easy. Of course you do.
And what
right?
you know.
And so, yeah, I mean, we have engineered these foods to be overconsumed, literally engineered and tested in a laboratory to make sure people eat too much, right? That's a good food to put on the supermarket. And that one goes out to the market. And we are full of these foods. And then we ask, gosh, why is everybody eating too much? It's like, well, you're trying to get, that's the whole point of this. Yeah. Anyway, maybe that's too simplistic, but that's my view. What would you say?
I think that the food environment that you described certainly makes everything harder. I don't think anybody would deny that. Everybody, if you're a smoker, you walk next to someone smoking a cigarette, and that triggers you. So I think that's totally valid to explain, to say why it's harder, and it's something we can do about it at the level of laws or culture. That's totally fair game for me. But if I think it's fundamentally about food access, I don't think so. Do I think it's secondary to increases in caloric intake? Like, do I think that's the inevitable outcome of an increased caloric intake? I don't think so either. But I think that when you will get obesity, you will have an increase in caloric intake. That's just how it seems to turn out. But I really do have a very different arrow of causality in that regard. And it's difficult because it's very frustrating for anyone who's advocating any sort of dietary change in general. You always get to see examples where what you advocated for doesn't work. And it's always hard to know if it's the advice that's not being followed or if it's for some other reason or what. But what I'm pretty confident about is that I don't, and this is maybe for a bias from my perspective, but I don't feel that rewarding food makes you consume more and thus gain weight, because I can very much remember being, for example, bread. I used to absolutely love bread. I said, man, if I become celiac one day, I don't know, I would, jump off a bridge. Like, I was that kid. I would say that. I never eat bread now. So what, I don't know what that is, right? You can be so addicted to one thing when you're a kid and love it, and then at some point you just, it doesn't faze me. It's of no interest to me. It's like I would eat it, I'd be like, oh yeah, I remember that, but it's no longer, it doesn't carry the same import. Yet I can have a, let's say, very, very tasty, very well cooked steak, just perfect when you're really hungry after exercising outside. Like, it can be extremely rewarding, and you could do that for the rest of my life. I would never get fat off it. It would be impossible. Like, I've tried. I cannot get fat off steak. There's only very few things I can get fat off, and I need to do it with a process. So like bread, if I do that, I've never gotten fat. I've gotten at most love handles, right? I'm pretty similar to you in that sense. I just don't get fat. But there are some foods I know it's literally impossible to make me fat with. And that kind of tells me, wow, it's really not about my discipline or my character, because I know so many people who are just way more careful than me about what they eat and how they eat and how much they eat, and they just balloon up so easily. And it's always like there's something else going on here. I don't know if it's the level of the brain, like Stefan Guyenet or some other people would describe it. Even though I'm doing a neuroscience PhD, that's not where I think the locus of ultimate control on obesity is. I think it's peripheral more so. I don't know, for some reason I have it in my mind that the brain wouldn't manage the size of my fat cells directly. I feel like it would be a job that's outsourced to something that doesn't need something so sophisticated. It just feels to me it's very fundamental. So I tend to look at the mitochondria, the electron transport chain, and try to explain it up from there. But like you, I try to take the long view of history with evolution biology. So yeah, that's why I was interested in your book. Although I haven't read it, I apologize. I've been reading about it in excerpts and stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, can you tell me and tell the listeners what they should take away from it? Because is it a public health message? Is it just an understanding? Is it a theory you absolutely want them to throw out that you can't stand? Like, what's the nugget there?
So it starts off, the foundation is how metabolism actually works, how your body actually takes food in and turns it into energy, and how it gets burned on these different tasks. And then we go from there to ask, okay, well then how does something like a lifestyle, how does how much I exercise change my metabolism and maybe change my weight, right? Because again, you can't talk about, if you talk about energy expenditure or energy intake, you're talking about weight inherently, because it's the balance, right? And so the couple of big surprising pieces that people I think probably haven't heard before is that the body actually responds to exercise in a way that makes exercise really good for you, but makes it hard to lose weight. And so exercise, for example, exercise, it's like the Hadza study. You can be more physically active. It doesn't actually change how many calories you burn every day. Instead, it seems to shuffle around how you spend your calories. And so you spend less on inflammation, for example, less on stress reaction, less on some other things. And so all that suppression makes exercise really good for you, actually, because you don't want to have inflammation and you don't want to have too much stress reactivity and cortisol levels. And, it actually reduces reproductive hormones a bit too, which is good. You don't want them sky high. You want them at a healthy range. So that reduction is actually probably one of the reasons exercise is so good for you. But also, of course, it means that it's hard to change energy expenditure very much. And so it's hard to exercise your way out of obesity or overweight, right? Because your body will adjust. And so now you're not spending extra calories anymore. And so I hope people will take away from it that the body and metabolism is a lot more interesting and dynamic than we're taught. And then, functionally, in your own day-to-day life, it means if you want to worry about weight, you need to think about your diet. And you can either take my perspective on this or yours or anybody's, but it has to be the food that's coming in.
Right.
That's where the energy, that's the problem, is the energy coming in. And if you want to focus on everything else, it's your health, heart health and cognitive health. I mean, diet and exercise have a lot of interplay, but exercise is really crucial for health, but bad for weight maintenance. Sorry, bad for weight loss. It's actually good for weight maintenance. If you can lose the weight, it seems to be good to help you keep it off. So just kind of rethinking about how your body actually burns calories and how lifestyle affects it. That's what I'm trying to get at. And, we get at that from an evolutionary point of view. So we talk about how metabolism evolves. We talk about hunter-gatherer perspectives and kind of thread all of that through to sort of give a different perspective. I was tired of reading, I won't name names because it's too mean, but I was tired of reading, nutrition and metabolism books that, I'm sure you can appreciate, are just completely divorced from the science of this stuff. And people who are yelling the loudest about how you can boost your metabolism or trick your metabolism, it's like, man, you've never measured a calorie in your life, And so, hopefully it's a corrective to that a little bit.
Okay, cool. That's I like it. It's interesting, and it's got a nice cover. I like it. It's a
good. That's important too.
One word cover with the flame. No, that's cool. I appreciate that. Yeah. Did you choose it? How did that come about?
Well, I chose the title. The title's mine.
Right.
But then the book is published with Penguin Random House, and they have art people that figure it all out. So I was really pleased because you don't get to pick.
Cool.
I mean, they ask you, "Do you like this?"
Right.
You're like, yeah. It was nice to get a good cover. I was excited about that.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So I guess one of the last points I'd like to raise and to get more of your thoughts on is, so in the paper that Mickey was the first author on, and Ran and myself, and we published this paper, just to summarize it very briefly, that's about where we fit into the food web, basically throughout human evolution, which we defined as the Pleistocene. And we go through different lines of evidence, and we suggest that humans are pretty much hypercarnivores, meaning they get more than 70% of their calories from animal foods, and that we have all these different lines of evidence that sort of converge towards one answer, that the answer being that one. So a big part of the argument that we put forward, so we're not the first ones to say that, but one of the things that comes with that is you want to make sure that the evidence you're going to use is valid, which everyone does whoever writes the paper. And in our situation, that meant is the question we had to ask ourselves is there what we call ecological confounding, which means that is the modern hunter-gatherer data that we have and the reports that we have and all of that, how much is that going to tell us about the people that lived thousands of years ago who are now dead? And we can maybe get their teeth, we can maybe get some of their bones, we can get some of their technology, we can look at their campsites, we can look at materials, and we can have a general picture. So basically, we went in with the view that we have to be a bit more circumspect about how much we make of modern evidence for these reasons related to climate, species availability, and considerations around technology. And I found your criticism of that perspective that we brought really interesting, because you had some specific points that you brought up. You had some papers showing that, you know, maybe we were more equatorial than was suggested in our paper. So I thought that was really valuable. So thank you. And maybe you can summarize that for people so they can hear it from you.
Sure. Well, and I should say that, you know, I thought that the work that you guys did to bring all those lines of evidence together and kind of, because this is one of these debates that doesn't get articulated very well, right? And people talk past each other. This is my line of evidence. This is my line of evidence. And so I thought it was great. Your work and with Mickey's been doing it for a while now, articulating this stuff. And I don't think we're going to agree.
No, that's fine.
But I think that the conversation is worthwhile and the debate's worthwhile. So
yeah.
Here's
and by the way, we cite you a lot throughout our work. I should say,
well,
I cite you a lot. So yeah, that's it's really good.
I appreciate it. So my point would be, each of the ecological things that you're pointing out all point to the fact that hominins in the past, in the Homo erectus, basically Homo habilis even till now, are eating meat. Right? Absolutely. And I don't think anybody is meaningfully disagreeing with that. Right? The question is how much meat. Yeah. That's the question. That's the trick, right? So would never argue that meat wasn't important. Of course it's important. And we see stone tools, we see cut marks on bones, we see the isotope evidence, and all of these things are changing. You are making a very specific argument, which I think is a harder one to defend, and you've made a very good case for it, but it's a harder one to defend because you're arguing that it isn't just 50% calories, which would be a typical hunter-gatherer these days. And we could argue about, you know, are they good models? Okay, but putting that aside, is it 50% meat? Yeah. Or no, you're saying it's over 70% meat in the diet for calories. I think that's harder to defend because the evidence for a few things, and I'll summarize what I would say. First of all, anytime that we see hunter-gatherers today, and okay, understood that they're bad models, perhaps. I don't think they are, but even if they are, what you see is a trend from eating more plants in equatorial areas In fact, even down to like 20 or 30% calories from meat, all the way up. There's a mix. It's a real diversity, but eating more plants when you're in equatorial climates, it's really only the people who are living very far north of 50 degrees latitude, which isn't inhabited until pretty recently, where you see lots of meat in the diet. And that's hunter-gatherers today. So it seems strange to me, speaking ecologically, that you would have hominins that surely were able to get plants. I mean, when would they have lost the ability? Of course they could. And we actually have archaeological evidence. A million or 1.2 million years ago, it's an Israeli site that has nicely preserved plant food particles. So we know that they could get plants, and it just seems strange to me that they wouldn't, right? I mean, everyone does today if they can. You have honey. That's a big part of the diet in hunter-gatherers today. And probably that goes way back in the past because you see, for example, the honey guide bird, which has actually co-evolved with humans, and that coevolution looks like, from the DNA evidence, has happened over 500,000 years, maybe more like 1 million or 2 years. You have the evidence for smaller guts, smaller teeth. Yeah, sure. But you also have cooking happening then. And don't forget that, right? And cooking actually is, the earliest evidence for cooking is about 1.5 million years ago, maybe one, for fire. Good hearths don't show up until about 450,000 years ago. But you've got good fire by 1 to 1.5 million years ago. Hard to believe they wouldn't have been cooking, but perhaps not, I don't know. But as soon as you have cooking, right? And I think you have to suggest that cooking might be 1 million years old, maybe a little more. You've got, you can have a smaller gut, you can have smaller teeth, you can have more energy available for bigger brains. And actually cooking has a bigger effect on plants than it does on meat in terms of calorie availability. It affects meat too, but it actually for calories. So again, nobody's arguing that meat's not really, really important.
Yeah.
When I look at it, I say, well, but am I convinced that it's 80% or something like this? I don't know. No, honestly, no, because I can see simpler explanations, in my mind, simpler explanations for that pattern of data.
Yeah. So what we might call fallback foods might actually be more of a closer to a staple then. If you consider maybe some simple collecting of starches, whether that's from nuts or from tubers, seasonally, you can imagine storage even before we were sort of settling down anywhere, just with carrying it with them. We know they had pouches and stuff. I mean, so sure. I think so it's interesting. So it's you're saying there's a better opportunity to exploit to turn carbs from indigestible to digestible with fire to a large extent.
That's for sure. Yeah. Yep.
So okay, you see more of a gain there being supported. Okay, that makes sense.
I mean, so so they've done cooking studies with Hadza tubers, for example, and the benefit isn't huge. So I think it's going to be species by species. For example, domesticated foods, the effect is really huge, and so we have to ask, well, why is there this difference in domesticated versus perhaps non-domesticated? How big is the effect? But in terms of calories available, the calories available don't change at all for meat.
Yeah.
Right. It makes it a little bit easier to chew, and you change the proteins a bit to make them yummier, but you don't actually put more calories in there.
Yeah.
Right.
And
whereas you turn insoluble carbs into soluble carbs when you cook plants.
Yeah. And what do you make of GI anatomy? How do you read that into the evidence to you? Because one of the arguments we make is that as we tend to see in different species, when the brain gets bigger, the gut gets shorter, the energy density of the food choices tend to go up. So I'm guessing fire is the key point here to explain how.
So I mean, again, meat in the diet, sure, and cooking too, right? We don't have we don't have gut lengths from Homo erectus. We have gut lengths from humans, modern humans today. But even if you did have it for Homo erectus and it was short, I mean, if you're cooking your food and if you have some meat in your diet, then of course you have a less fiber just because you're replacing some of it with meat.
Yeah.
And you have, if you're cooking it, especially, you have much more, you don't have to spend as much time fermenting the fiber in your colon. Instead, you just pass through faster and you get the energy out and go. I don't disagree that you've got a shorter colon. Of course you do.
Yeah.
But it fits with cooking and a mixed meat and plant diet
Honey
to me
and,
easily.
Yeah. Okay. Of course. Absorption in the small intestine. There's lots of stuff that can go through there. Not a problem. Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what about the stable isotopes? So those were some of the most interesting pieces of evidence for me when I was learning about this when I was younger, and I found it really interesting because I was my bias when I first read those papers years ago was, wow, I had no idea. Like, I would never have guessed we would have been on a similar level as wolves or others. I genuinely thought we were, lower down the scale.
I agree.
So, yeah, what does that tell you? Because that was really interesting to me.
I think it's the strongest piece of evidence in your favor, honestly.
Right.
And so here's what I would say. Those populations are your best evidence for hypercarnivores, I think. I would say that those are northern populations, and so we would expect to have more meat in the north anyway. And it happens. And so if we can get, as we get better and better at this, maybe we can get some stable isotopes from more warmer climate groups. That'd be really cool to see. And then, hey, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I would bet you that you'll see a change in that. But the other thing you need to remember is, and this is, I'll stick by that prediction, but I'll also say this. Mammoths have nitrogen isotope ratios that are already really high. And so if you're getting a lot of your protein from meat, and specifically if you're getting a lot of your protein from mammoth meat, you're going to have a high signal. And again, I'm not arguing that they weren't eating mammoths and they weren't getting meat. Of course they were. But you're arguing that that's kind of all they're eating. And I'm not so sure about that. The other thing I would say is, the way that things work out is interesting. Mammoths have higher nitrogen ratios, for example, than do bears. Do we really think that mammoths are eating more meat than bears? Of course not, right? And so I think we have to interpret those things carefully and think about how we're getting it. But no, I think the isotopes are actually the strongest piece of evidence in your favor.
Cool. Interesting. So please tell me about the work that you have coming up, if you can tell us anything about it. Because for whatever goes on in the low carb community, I think everybody finds your work interesting.
Thanks.
Which should be high praise. Honestly, it's very wide, as we were saying before. So if you can tell us anything that's coming up that we'd like to know about, please do.
Yeah, sure. Well, right now we're trying to track down exactly how your body adjusts to exercise. When you exercise more, it seems like things are getting changed, but that right now is kind of correlational work. We haven't done the study yet where we take somebody who's sedentary, get them exercise, and then we watch the switches get turned. I want to do that study.
Yeah, that's really cool.
We're expanding the groups we work with. So we're working with a pastoralist group now in northern Kenya. So we'll have some low carb pastoralist subsistence groups to throw into the mix on how that works. There's been so much work on the Maasai, but the group is called the Dasnich, and they're culturally similar in some ways to the Maasai and how they make a living. And so there'll be a nice piece of the interest there isn't just their diet, but it'll be a big piece of this overall health study that we're doing there. And those are the two big things, kind of broadening out the field work and then diving down deep into this mechanism of how the body adjusts to exercise. And we have some other things going on too, but with some looking at different aspects of like reproduction, energetics, and that kind of stuff. But anyway, those are the two big things. Lots of fun stuff going on.
Super interesting. Wow, I'm jealous. that's really
well,
cool.
Hey, yeah. I look forward to keeping up the conversation. And really, man, I just want to say that I think I love Twitter because I learned so much. I've actually got recently, I think I get all my papers off of Twitter. Somebody tweets a paper, I go, oh, that's really good. So much easier than scrolling PubMed. And I really I like the back and forth with you and Mickey and that kind of stuff too. But I also, part of me thinks, oh, sometimes it feels kind of mean, or it's because it's so short. and it feels kind of
Yeah,
like,
yeah, it's curt.
but I don't feel
Yeah.
that way. I know you don't either, and it's just nice to have the
That's good.
conversation face to face, because I think
Yeah, no, it's
this
a
is
pleasure.
healthier.
Yeah, definitely. There's some
Yeah.
things, you have to go long form. And if I can be so selfish as to ask you one last question, I nearly forgot to ask you. So I love ice baths and all that kind of stuff. I'm one of
Oh yeah.
those, I'm one of those people. And I'm pretty, I'm a human radiator, right? Like my girlfriend's always like, like pushing me away, like you're too warm and
Yeah, yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
So I'm wondering, do you think there's something to body temperature changes and obesity? Is that worth tracking? Would you make predictions like, hey, if you're starting to lose fat, your body temperature is going to increase, sort of stuff? Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah. It's a nice idea. Again, I don't see the data for it yet. Here's the, so the brown adipose tissue stuff is
Yeah.
people are excited about that. But if you look at the number of calories you actually burn in brown adipose tissue, it's not very much.
Right.
And the other problem is this: this is just a little sidebar, but I think it points to
Yeah.
the issues here. There's a great study, or a handful of them actually, that say, look, people who are overweight have less brown adipose tissue. Look, see, isn't that telling you something?
All right.
And I go, yeah, it's telling me that if you have a layer of subcutaneous fat, you don't get cold. And so your body makes less brown, beige is less of your, and so the causal arrow can go either way. So I don't know. I would love, definitely watch that space, because it's a new area, relatively speaking. It's a couple of years old now. I don't know. And the other thing is, people who do live in really cold climates. There's been work in Siberia, and now I've got a colleague, a former student of mine, who's doing a new work in Finland with reindeer herders up there.
Oh, nice.
You do see elevated like basal metabolic rates in people who live in cold all the time.
Right.
But total expenditures aren't a whole lot different. And those populations are not particularly slim, right? It isn't like, so, I don't know, man. I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting, because one of the things that got me interested in it was the fact that cold exposure in type 2 diabetic patients was actually really good for their glucose levels. Yeah, so that could be a whole bunch of things, because you're depleting glycogen from the shivering, because shivering is fueled through glycogen. So I was always wondering, like, I was like, maybe it's too simple, but is there something to, because like you were saying, exercise is not a good solution for fat loss. But I'm thinking, what about cold? Like, is that maybe because you lose so much energy through the cold compared to exercising? I was like, maybe there could be something there. So I thought I'd ask you.
Yeah, man. I mean, it's worth giving it a try. I'd love to see that study. I've only ever heard sort of circumstantial ideas, circumstantial evidence. I haven't seen the study that shows it yet. But if you can, sleep.
Yeah, I'll send you it.
You sleep cold, you'll do better.
Right. Sleep with the cold. Yeah. No, I'll send you that. It's a small study, but it was in diabetics over, I think, 10 days or 2 weeks or something.
Oh, so cool. That's great.
And like sort of like walking outside in a shirt in 14 degree temperature, so nothing too crazy either. And I was like, wow, like that changed their glucose. Okay, interesting.
Wow. Yeah. I would one thing to add to that is just, there's really fun evidence that I like. I've been trying to think about, the hunter-gatherer stuff and subsistence stuff and why they're so healthy. And you just said about walking outside. And I think there's a lot to that. Being outside in the sun, right? And being happy and not feeling stressed about your work. I think there's a lot to that too. And I would like to see, I don't have plans to do this kind of work, but I would love to see a kind of more holistic idea about, diet and exercise. Okay, fine. But what about, do you get outside? Do you have friends? Are you working too much? I think these things matter too. So.
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah. Quality of life is not we measure it for a reason. It matters.
Yeah.
So for sure, definitely. Well, man, thank you for the time. That was really enriching and fun, and I hope we can do it again next time you publish or have anything to talk about, or another book or whatever you end up doing. So it was a pleasure.
Sounds good, man. Great. Thanks for the invitation. It was really fun. Do it again.
Awesome. All right. Check out Herman's book, everyone. Make sure you go check it out. All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.